To order. Welcome to meeting number 128, a House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. Reminder as always on avoiding feedback that hurts our interpreters. Keep your earpieces away from microphones at all times. We welcome our Auditor General, A.G. Hogan. Welcome back to OGO, the only committee that matters, not public accounts. We have you for a 5-minute opening statement. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on professional services contracts, which was tabled in Parliament last week. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Joining me today are Nicholas Swales, the principal who was responsible for the audit, Stephen Mariani, the director who led the audit team, and Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General. This audit looked at whether federal contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company between 2011 and 2023 complied with applicable policies and provided Canadians with value for money spent. These contracts spanned 20 federal organizations, including 10 Crown corporations. The total value of contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company during the period totaled $209 million, of which about $200 million was spent. We found that the organizations awarding the contracts showed a frequent disregard for federal contracting and procurement policies and guidance. We also found that each organization's own practices often did not demonstrate value for money. The extent of non-compliance and risks to value for money varied across organizations. For example, in 10 of the 28 contracts that were awarded through a competitive process, the bid evaluations did not include enough information to support the selection of McKinsey & Company as the winning bidder. Nous avons aussi constaté.
When it came to non-competitive contracts, organizations often did not provide the justification. About 70% of the 97 contracts we looked at that were awarded to McKinsey & Company as non-competitive contracts. And their value was approximately $118 million. We also sampled and reviewed 33 contracts to assess value for money. And we found that almost half of the contracts lacked an explanation of what need or gap the contract was intended to address. In 15% of contracts, there was no clear statement of what the contract would deliver. And in 18% of contracts, there was no confirmation that the government had received all expected deliverables. As the central purchasing and contracting agent and subject matter expert for the Government of Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada did not challenge organizations when awarding some contracts on their behalf. The department did not challenge the organizations requesting the contracts about whether the procurement strategy used was appropriate when multiple contracts were awarded to McKinsey & Company for a similar purpose and within a short period of time. Our single recommendation focused on the need for federal organizations to proactively address conflicts of interest in the procurement process. All other aspects of our findings were covered in recommendations recently made by other organizations, such as the Office of the Procurement Ombudsman and internal audit functions.
It focused on contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company. It highlights basic requirements and good practices that all federal organizations should follow when procuring professional services on behalf of the Government of Canada. Federal contracting and procurement policies exist to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians, but they only work if they are followed. The remedy isn't necessarily about creating new processes or rules, but rather about understanding how these processes and rules are applied and why often they are not. Monsieur le Président, je termine.
Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks, and we would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Hogan, we'll start Mrs. Kusi for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madam Auditor General, for being here today along with your team. And thank you again for this report, which sheds even more light and I believe confirms even further the thoughts and ideas we had around contracting in the public service, both in adherence to the rules, as well as a favoritism towards McKinsey. Madam Auditor General, last week, I asked you to inform the Public Accounts Committee the date the 3 Canada Infrastructure Bank contracts were signed with McKinsey. Do you have those dates with you today?
I'm just going to turn to Nick and he can provide that to you.
Yes, we do. Just give me a moment to pull it up.
It's next question, or do you have it?
I have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
25th of January 2018, 30th of March 2018, and 19th of May 2020.
Okay, 19th of May 2020. Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Madam Auditor General, Mr. Dominic Barton chaired the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which started in 2016. And shortly after, interestingly coinciding with these dates, we see a 2,500% increase from 2016 to 2023 in contracts awarded to McKinsey. In your opinion, is it a conflict of interest to have the global head of a company also chairing an economic advisory committee that helps determine the direction of a government?
I mean, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I'm not sure in what capacity he was providing advice as the chair of that committee, what his requirements were. So I unfortunately can't offer up an opinion on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll return to a theme I mentioned in my opening comment, favoritism in contracting. McKinsey received 2 contracts with IRCC for close to $25 million. And it's from these contracts and the Economic Advisory Council, chaired by Mr. Dominic Barton, that led to the infamous 500,000 immigration target that this government is now walking back from. How dangerous is it for a company to chair an advisory council that sets policy in an effort to help its own interests, would you say?
Again, I'm sorry, I don't know much about what that committee was doing, so it would be inappropriate for me to provide thoughts or opinions on it.
Okay, thank you. There were 4 instances in the competitive procurement process where your office found that the procurement strategy was changed after departments learned McKinsey could not bid under the original circumstances. And unfortunately, to no one's surprise, McKinsey won the bid under new criteria. Can a department call it a competitive process when they are changing the requirements to cater towards one specific company, in this case, McKinsey and Company?
So in the case of the 4 contracts that you're referring to, there were 2 where there was a change in strategy. And while the federal government is able to change its procurement approaches as it goes about, I would have expected to see a justification on file as to why they made such a switch. And then because 2 contracts were awarded in a non-competitive way, and clearly documenting why McKinsey would have been the only bidder or what exception was being used from the procurement rules to award a contract non-competitively. And as we mentioned, more than half of the contracts that we looked at that were awarded non-competitively did not have a good justification on file.
Thank you for that. Now, referring to your previous work on Arrive scam as well, since GC Strategies was allowed to sit at the table and negotiate the terms of its own contract as well, can you confirm, although I am hearing it in the response you gave to my last question, that this is happening frequently across departments? Would you say that this is happening frequently across departments?
I guess I want to draw a distinction between what we saw in ArriveCan and what we're seeing here. In ArriveCan, we clearly saw that GC Strategies was involved in setting the selection criteria. We did not see that in the McKinsey contracts. We saw that at times when there were competitive bids run, that the criteria, the selection criteria, weren't always used, but not that McKinsey had been involved in setting the selection criteria. So they're very different, different situations.
So then, given that, in your opinion, what specifically needs to be changed? What changes need to be made to ensure Canada's procurement processes are truly competitive?
When it comes to competitive contracts, what we found is that often there was, I think it was about more than a third of the time, the bid evaluation didn't have selection criteria that were clearly outlined, or when there were selection criteria, they weren't used. It's clear in the rules that you need to set out these criteria, and then you need to have a good evaluation grid and a committee put together. So again, to make this competitive process fair and transparent, the existing rules should have been applied.
Excellent. I'll end my time there, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Auditor General, again for the report and for being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mrs. Kusti. Mr. Jouari, please, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Hogan, welcome back to you and your team. Thank you for the great work that you continue to do. I want to go back, and my understanding is you looked at a period of 1st of January 2011 to 7th of February of 2023. From a procedural point of view, it looks like there were a lot of procedures were not being followed. Was this consistent during this period? Were there any period that stood out more, not just because of the number, but from a procedural changes?
I know our conclusion that there was a frequent disregard for the rules was because it was across 8 departments and agencies, or sorry, 9 departments and agencies and 10 crown corporations, but it was spread out over the 12-year period. So there isn't one year that sticks out more than other, except near the end where the National Master Standing Offer would have been used for 19 contracts. And in our view, the justification for using that was not well documented. That there would have been a slight spike there, but there still was a lack of following the rules across the whole 12-year period.
Okay, so lack of following the rules throughout the whole 12 years. Now, also, when we look at it, the difference between department, agencies, and Crown Corporation, did you see any difference between department, agencies, and Crown Corporation as far as following the procedures and making sure everything is well documented?
I mean, it's a tough one. There's 97 contracts, and I would tell you that almost each contract has its unique story, with it. But when we looked at how frequent rules were not being followed, it didn't matter whether it was a Crown or a department or agency. It's important to note that the Crown corporations had their own rules. They don't usually follow the Treasury Board rules. But there was still a frequent disregard for not following them. Again, the most being really not documenting why a non-competitive process.
So thank you. And that was a very important point. Crown Corporation have their own policies, procedures, systems, and they're not following TBSs, whereas the department and agencies do. And there was still this common disregard, not only across the years, but even across between the Crown corporations as well as the department and agencies. Now, I want to go back to where you nearly closed, and you said the remedy, and you made recommendation, and thank you for the recommendations that you've made. You pointed us back to a number of previous recommendations, and you basically said, just go and do it. And these are the newer recommendations, and you've made 2, which kept very clear focus on what we should do, what the government should do. Now, looking at your nearly closing statement, you said the remedy isn't necessarily about creating new processes or rules, but rather about understanding how these processes and rules are applied and why often they're not. Can you expand on that one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think over time, whenever there's an audit done, whether it be by an internal audit department, the Controller General's office, the Procurement Ombuds, or my office, the tendency is to add more rules. And I think here the case was not that there were rules that were missing, except for conflict of interest, which is why we issued one there. But that the rules just need to be followed. And I think it's important for the federal government to sit back and try and assess why this is happening. What is it about the procurement rules that are driving the behavior that we're seeing? There are many reasons that could be there. Is it that the rules are so complex in order to speed up the procurement process? People are working around the rules? Is it that there are so many rules that they don't know them all and are accidentally not applying it? Or is there some other behavior that is driving what we're seeing? Because it's clear that the rules are there to ensure fairness, transparency, and accountability and delivering value for money. It's just they're not being followed.
So thank you. That was a great coverage with can you tell me, in your opinion, do you think those rules, because I'm sure you've looked at it, do you think those rules are complicated? Because you're clearly saying, let's not add more rules to it, which we really support, because we are doing a study and my colleagues are going to follow up on that. But do you think our rules are complicated?
I think there are a lot of rules, and at times they can be complicated. And I think there was a recent announcement by the Treasury Board about adding certain certifications around procurement processes. And I appreciate that additional layer that was added. It wasn't about adding a rule, but about reminding people to certify that they have done certain things in the rules. I would tell you there is some confusion. If we look at the National Master Standing Offer, I think most organizations believed that because they had to use the standing offer, that they could just pull off of it. But what's clear is that that is just an offer of goods and services. It isn't a contract. So when you create a contract that is done in a non-competitive way, the rules kick in that say you should justify why. And often that justification was lacking. So I think there it was that folks didn't understand necessarily what the rules were. So I think it's a bit of both. There's a lot, they're complex, and they're not always easy to follow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jory. Mrs. Vignola, please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, gentlemen, welcome. McKinsey is a small player in Canada, but a big international player and has the power to influence and pull strings. Now, out of 349,000 civil servants, do you think there are many people who used to work for McKinsey? I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I didn't look into the numbers of civil servants previously working for McKinsey. Well, who would be able to figure that out? And would it be a conflict of interest? Well, I don't know who would be able to do that. Perhaps Treasury Board. But perhaps I'd draw your attention to one of our observations, and that is that an assessment of conflict of interest is very important during the procurement process. So statements of conflicts of interest are done yearly by ourselves, but not necessarily every time there is a contract. That's why I think that a statement of conflict of interest is required and should be required whenever there is contracting. There are several factors that really did surprise me when I was reading your report, which is excellent in passing. Congratulations to your entire team. I noticed that in 45% of cases, of the cases that you looked at, so you didn't look at all of them, you looked at a sample, people don't know what they want, they don't know if it's necessary, they don't know if they got what they wanted, and they don't even know if they met their goals. This is quite frightening. And it makes me wonder about how long this has been happening, how long these kinds of contracts have been happening, and how long their value has lasted. Did you have the same kinds of questions? Well, sometimes I do. I think it truly depends on the goal of the contract. Now, if you look at these contracts, they were for example, benchmarking. They were to support transformation and change. Sometimes it was to provide professional advice. So it's difficult to assess. You're not creating something tangible like an application. You're requesting expert advice. So sometimes it's difficult to assess whether those deliverables happened. But there are some basic things that should have happened. What is the need you're trying to address? That would be one good question. Half of the contracts we looked at approximately did not have the kind of supporting document. And there should be a proactive assessment of the cost to be able to set a budget. In 91% of the contracts, that kind of assessment or estimate didn't happen. So these are basic things that should happen. And so ultimately, if in 20% of contracts, if those deliverables haven't happened, well, yes, that does raise questions. But I think this starts from the very beginning. So you're saying that from the outset, there are problems. In one of my former lives, I was a coordinator under a strategy program for underprivileged areas. And there was no program that could be done. There was no funding that could happen unless you had an assessment. And what you're telling me here is that from the outset, people don't know what they want. But then in terms of the analyses and the needs, there's no actual guarantee that the need will be addressed over time. So do you think that over time, there's this memory loss about the ability to benchmark within these organizations and an ability to identify that need before you go outside? Well, I think what's very important is to identify why you need that contract. And if you don't, then you have catch up to do. So let's say that you have a transformation project. There are oftentimes contracts that are awarded to help the government figure out how it can undertake that transformation. So you need to go for outside advice. It's human nature to always want to do things the same way. So sometimes it does take someone from the outside to help. But what I would expect is that there be a report, that there be something to show what that added value is. I remember hearing here once, someone who made fun of a public servant saying that, well, it was surprising that they had ideas and that their ideas had been used. So sometimes it's true that you need new eyes. You need a view from the outside to see what can be improved. And oftentimes our internal resources are underused, but they're also ridiculed. You know, it's just assumed that public servants don't have the job to think. Do you think that would be a mentality that has to change? Do you think sometimes some of the upper levels should go and sit down in the cafeteria with these employees? Well, I would say that our own office is going through a transformation and looking at how we work, looking at how to work more effectively. And I saw some resistance to change. I did hire some people from the outside to come and bring their perspective. And as soon as there is openness to new ideas, well, then you come up with all kinds of other ideas. So I think that there are many people within the public service who have good ideas.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Hogan, for being back with the committee to share your work. Some disturbing findings for sure, and I think the questions that my colleagues have already asked start to get at the nub of what we're trying to figure out as a committee. In my view, there are two theses here. One is that the government is tight with McKinsey and so is showing favoritism towards one vendor. The other thesis is that there's a perception within the public service that the rules are overly restrictive, and in order to get things done, they have to break the rules. And I'm wondering which of those, in your view, is more likely to be the dominant contributing factor in what we're seeing?
Well, I think in some of our findings, we did find that there were 6 contracts that seemed to be designed to suit McKinsey and Company, whether it was organizations waiting for them to have their own national master standing offer so that they could use them for benchmarking services when there were other existing standing offers with benchmarking services, or just changing their procurement strategy, as we talked about earlier on. So we saw that in 6 contracts, but what's more concerning for me is the frequent disregard for the rules, right? There were, when we looked at a sample, I would have said there's probably, more than half where it was more than one rule that wasn't followed. So it isn't that we just highlighted it when it was one rule. So this just points to, I think, both things working, whether there might be sometimes a tendency to look for a vendor, but there is clearly a tendency to not apply all of the rules. And we need to figure out why in the public service that is happening.
Do you expect that we would see the same pattern if your investigation was broadened to include other vendors?
Based on the findings here, because there were only 6 contracts that appeared to suit McKinsey, I have no reason to believe that this is unique to McKinsey and Company. I would expect that we would see similar behaviors for other professional services and other contracts in general. When you add on the layer that it was 8 out of 10 departments and agencies, or sorry, 9 out of 10 departments and agencies, and 8 out of 10 crown corporations where we had issues with the rules being followed. That is a wide range. So it can't just be limited to McKinsey.
Now, I'm curious, in the course of your work, did you speak with the people in charge of these procurements? And did you ask them why they seem to be flagrantly breaking the rules that govern their work? Did they provide an explanation?
Well, we typically review files and then speak to individuals. The degree to which we communicated, I'll have to turn to Nick and see how much he engaged, but we would have engaged with every single of the 20 organizations.
Did you ask them why?
We certainly spoke to the organizations, bearing in mind the time frame for the contracts. In most cases, the individuals responsible were not in that role anymore. And so, but I think, Ms. Hogan made a mention earlier about, particularly around the NMSO, a lot of confusion about how the rules were supposed to be applied in that case that came through in the conversations that we had.
People in charge of procurement were confused as to the rules that they were required to follow?
That's right.
If the committee wanted to understand the motivations or the reasons behind this flagrant, what seems like flagrant breaking of the rules, who would we talk to?
Who would you talk to in each of the organizations, or just
Like
in
we can
general?
bring anyone before committee and ask them what they were thinking when they broke all the rules to give work to McKinsey. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out who that is.
Well, I think it depends where you're going. I would tell you that deputy heads and heads of crowns of corporations should be able to answer questions about all procurement within their organization, even though they were not the ones actually signing the contracts. But it would be either CFOs, individuals in procurement groups. I mean, there are many layers. I guess it depends what you're looking for, and recognizing, as Nick mentioned, this was over a 12-year period. People move around a lot in the public service, and if you're looking for the specific individual, you just might not find them.
Would one way to test this thesis be to simply expand this work slightly to include a broader sample of vendors and look at whether the same patterns occur?
Well, I think that would be one choice. What I would also think is a good option is that we've also encouraged all departments and agencies and crowns to improve their compliance and quality control around procurement. I think it's time to give the public service a chance to recognize and refresh all of the rules and then go back and look, because I believe, as I said, I have no reason to believe that my results would be any differently if I expanded this.
And how about accountability? Like, what's at stake here is value for money. This is Canadians' money. It's being spent poorly. There's one company that's enriching itself to the tune of, millions and millions of dollars. There are individuals that make a decision to break the rules, and whether they know the rules exist or not, there's still some culpability there. How do we ensure that people are held accountable, and where does accountability ultimately fall in this place?
You have about 5 seconds for an answer.
I've said it before. I think ultimately accountability rests with the deputy head or the head of a crown corporation to make sure that all of their contracting provides value for money.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bachrach. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome back to our committee, Ms. Hogan, and to your departmental officials. In your audit, you found multiple instances of favoritism being shown to McKinsey. In one instance, the Business Development Bank of Canada gave a contract to McKinsey, despite McKinsey not being the highest scoring bid. They also gave 2 sole source contracts without documenting their justification, and my colleague mentioned that in her intervention. And the Canada Border Services Agency had 3 contracts missing bid evaluation documents, and Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada had 2 contracts missing bid evaluation documents. And as my colleagues have been pointing out around the table this morning, we see repeated abuses of the procurement system with seemingly no checks and balances in place from the government. And it would appear no concern or pushback as well. If the exception becomes the rule, then I believe this becomes the culture and that we have a huge problem within the government. How is this allowed to happen with no consequences for those who are failing to follow the rules?
I do agree that when 70% of the contracts awarded were done so in a non-competitive way, it raises concern when non-competition should be the default. Competition ensures that you hopefully get a better price for taxpayers. I guess that doesn't always mean that it is the lowest bidder. There could be business reasons that you might choose a different bidder, but again, I would expect that kind of a judgment call is well supported and documented. I think often that's what we're missing here, is that the rules aren't being followed, and then there is no demonstration for what business decision drove that. And I would really like to see everyone across the federal government sort of have more rigor in their procurement processes. This isn't a big burden that we're asking. It is about just being transparent and being able to answer to Canadians 10 or 12 years down the line why a decision was made. And it starts with understanding the rules and then documenting all of the judgment calls that are made along the way.
I want to confirm what I believe I heard you say in regards to accountability, and that there needs to be accountability within a department, regardless of whether a department head, a deputy minister, an assistant deputy minister, any one of those individuals were involved in the procurement that they need to be held accountable for decisions that are made within their department and when rules are not being followed. Is that what I heard you say?
I believe that Andrew's going to want to jump in here, but I think I would start off by saying that legislation makes it clear that the deputy head's the accounting officer of an organization. And while you might delegate those powers to others in the organization for day-to-day to happen, because, for example, I couldn't review every single contract that my office issues, but you still have to make sure that people are properly trained, they understand the rules, and there's good compliance and overview. So I don't know, Andrew, if you want to add something?
The only thing I would add is that we stressed in our ArriveCan report the importance of delegated decision makers understanding and being accountable for the decisions that they make to spend public money. So as much as the deputy head is the responsible person to answer and be accountable here at committee and before Parliament, there is an accountability all the way through the organization that should be enforced.
And I'm not sure how much time I have, but I would ask, does being moved out of a position sever the responsibility that you might hold when you were in that position making decisions?
I mean, my view is not. I would expect, however, that you left a really good file behind to demonstrate the judgment calls and the decisions that you made. People's memories are going to fail, and so it's important to make sure you document something when you're going through it.
Thanks very much. Mr. Kuzmirchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Ms. Hogan, to you and, your team and the entire Auditor General team for your incredibly important work that you're bringing forward for Canadians and to this committee. So thank you so much. All of us are seeking stronger and better accountability. I wanted to ask you, there were 97 contracts that you looked at, 10 departments, and also 10 arm's length Crown agencies. There is a variation in terms of the degree of non-compliance that you found. Are there departments that scored better or scored well or had even a clean bill of health in your review? And if there is, what does that tell you about some of the challenges that we're facing here if some departments actually did okay?
I'm going to ask Nick or Stephen to pull out the one. As I mentioned, there was 9 out of 10 departments and agencies that did not follow the rules when it came to procurement. So we'll get you the name of the one. I mean, but even there, we have to recognize that at times they did, right? And so I think that's what speaks to the need to refresh and remind everyone of the rules. And I would expect that it's not just training, but that there would then be a monitoring and an oversight and compliance that happens after the fact. An individual might only do one contract every couple of years, and you can't be expected to remember all of the rules. So I think it's important to do that refresh. Nick, do you have the name? I tried to speak long enough so that you
Yes,
can
so I
help
got
me.
that. Natural Resources Canada was the organization, the federal department and agency where we found that they had followed the rules. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the number of contracts, which in some cases there were more, which increases your risk of missing a rule.
Okay, no, gotcha. I did want to ask a question. Inside your report, you talked about the chains of non-competitive contracts. Can you explain the what that means, the chains of non-competitive contracts, and what are the risks specifically to these chains of contracts?
So I think I just want to be clear that that's a word we described. We didn't know a better way to describe what we were seeing. It isn't a term commonly used. For me, what it shows is that if you issue the first contract in a competitive way and then issue subsequent contracts in a non-competitive way, you're limiting competition. And as I said, the default of competition to drive better value for money is important. More concerning is the chain of contracts where the first contract is a small contract that called on an exception under the contracting rules, that if it's under a certain dollar threshold, there was no need for competition. It wouldn't provide better value for money. But then to use the subsequent exception for the follow-on contracts that were of a larger dollar value in the millions of dollars, again, starts to question, did you not think at the beginning what your need was that you needed to fill? It comes down to that fundamental starting question, but constantly says, well, are you then more dependent or creating a dependency on a vendor if you're issuing multiple non-competitive contracts, and how are you ensuring best value for money if none of them are being competed? So I think it brings in so many rules when we see the chains, which just raised a lot of concerns for us.
Any of the 97 contracts that you looked at, did you see any political interference in any of the 97 contracts? So interference from elected officials or politicians?
So no, we did not see political interference in the contracts that we looked at. We did see that a minister was involved in one procurement because it was a non-competitive procurement above the threshold that public services allowed to issue on their own. So in accordance with the rules, they went to the minister authorized it, and then the government issued the contract as they normally would have through their regular processes.
Were politicians, elected officials driving the decisions to offer these contracts to this vendor or any vendor that you saw? Were they the drivers?
We did not see that there was a push from a political aspect to direct any contracts to McKinsey.
These decisions were made by public servants, by public officials or bureaucrats, as they're often called. Is that correct?
Correct. The decisions that we saw were made by public servants. Even in the 6 contracts that appeared to be designed to suit McKinsey and Company, it was the public service that made those decisions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuzmierczak. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, I'd like to come back to the duty to do an in-depth review. So there is an opportunity to ask questions about contracts, that is to say PSPC. Can they challenge any decisions about contracts? And do they have the ability to make sure that all stages of the process have gone through? And if they haven't, then can they require that those steps be followed before the contract is awarded? Well, the responsibility of PSPC is to challenge the tool being used for procurement. Oftentimes, we saw that they didn't challenge. For example, in cases where there were several contracts awarded over a short period of time. But I think also, ultimately, it is the department requesting the service that has the last say, even though PSPC can challenge the decision. Now, when there are these chains of contracts that we've seen, if the contract is below a threshold, then PSPC wouldn't be aware. The only way that it would be made aware of the contract is if the department were to tell them. So they have the power to challenge, but ultimately it doesn't really mean anything that the department has the last word. Well, if that contract is awarded individually by another department, yes. Now, this word benchmarking has come up. In other words, there's a decision to go with a certain provider because they are experts in that type of analysis. Now, over 160 years, have these kinds of tools not been developed? Do we not have the ability to have these marking services? That is to say, our own tools, our own services? Can we not have those best practices and that ability to identify best practices? Well, there are organizations within the private sector who are specialists in benchmarking. I think the public service has this kind of information. For example, take Statistics Canada, but oftentimes what is needed is that outside information, that outside perspective to understand what the private sector is doing and to compare it to the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to ask a similar question to my colleague around the role of PSPC. It seems possibly defensible that some people within specific departments might not be familiar with all of the procurement rules, but you would think that the department that is solely responsible for procurement would know all of the rules and would be able to challenge the departments when they see those rules being flagrantly broken. Like, is PSPC not living up to its purported reason for being? Like, this is the whole model that we have, and it doesn't seem to be working.
So I mean, we did find in this audit that they could have done a better job at challenging many of the organizations, especially when there was multiple contracts that appeared to be issued for similar work in a really short period of time. But there are things that they're not aware of. So I am, as I mentioned earlier, if a contract's issued below a dollar value threshold, it's only the department that issued that contract would be aware of it. There is no big central repository for all of that information. But when it comes to the National Master Standing Offer, let's look at that, for example. I believe the Deputy Minister has been before committee before, testifying on how she didn't believe that the call-ups required a documentation. I think I had a very lengthy conversation with her about, but the National Master Standing Offer is just an offer. It's not the contract. So when the contract happens, it should be required. I think following the procurement ombud's work, she actually changed the requirements and now is reminding every department that they should provide that justification. So I think this is a learning opportunity as certain tools are used more often, that rigor needs to be put into documenting decisions.
How many seconds, Mr. Chair?
35.
Okay. it seems, coming back to McKinsey, it seems like sometimes you end up with this bias in organizations towards vendors that are either the biggest or have the most high profile reputation because it's seen as the safest option. That if something goes wrong, nobody can blame them for choosing such a reputable, high profile firm, as opposed to an upstart, one with less of a reputation, one that has less profile. Is that something that you see in procurement decision making, that there's a bias towards higher profile firms because it's seen as being the safest choice?
I'm
Very
not
brief answer, please.
I'm not sure that I can say that we saw that in these 97 contracts. I think I would call into question the national master standing offer. They existed with other organizations as well for benchmarking services. So there were other companies at the disposal of departments, and I would have expected that they would have documented why McKinsey over the other national master standing offer companies.
Thanks very much. Mr. Genuis, 5, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we're here looking at the government's cozy relationship with McKinsey, and thank you again to the Auditor General for your excellent work exposing significant problems, 200 million in contracts that have gone to McKinsey under this government, most of which in some way or another did not adhere to the rules. You've just mentioned the important role that PSPC, the government's contracting department, is supposed to play, could have played, challenging some of these procurements. In that light, I think it's interesting to note that the Director of Policy to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, Mr. Boyan Gerasimov, he had this critical role of Director of Policy in the Minister of Public Services and Procurement's office during the critical period of the pandemic from March 2020 until December 2021. He is McKinsey alum. He served with McKinsey for more than 5 years as an engagement manager, went from working with McKinsey into this Liberal government in an important senior staff role. His LinkedIn specifically cites work he did in relation to major defense equipment procurements. So you have former McKinsey in this critical role in government procurement in the Minister of Procurement's office under then Minister Anita Anand, a former McKinsey employee, and you've highlighted that the government's contracting department that he was working for could have provided a greater challenge function, and they didn't. And we've also seen how the Defense Department in particular had a very close, extensive relationship with McKinsey. So this is quite concerning to me. It underlines the close relationships that exist between McKinsey and this Liberal government. I wonder if you could share a bit more about what role the minister's office did play or could have played, providing a challenge function around this extensive procurement relationship that emerged, and what conclusions we might be able to draw about the role that the Director of Policy in Minister Anand's office should have been playing, could have been playing, did play in relation to these procurements.
So typically I would not expect ministers to be involved at all in procurement decisions that are made by departments. And when we looked at these 97 contracts, we did not see ministerial involvement except for one where it was required by the rules. I would expect that PSPC would do a better challenge function in some of these contracts. In other areas, we saw that they did do a good challenge function. I think ultimately it boils down to making sure that everyone who's involved in the procurement process understands the rules and applies them in a way to ensure fairness, transparency, and good value for money for Canadians.
So the function of the minister's office is to set a policy framework, and the Director of Policy plays a key role in that. You're saying you wouldn't want to see them involved in kind of micro procurement decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess for them to have a function at all, presumably it's to set that policy framework in which says how sharply they're going to exercise that challenge function or not. And there clearly were failures to challenge McKinsey procurement in cases where it should have been challenged from that department. Is that correct?
For sure. I think that PSPC should have done a better job at challenging some of the procurements that were brought to them for them to be able to issue contracts. But I would expect that challenge function also exists in every department an agency because not all contracts go through PSPC in order to be issued.
Right. No, and I think there are problems in other places for sure, but it stuck out to me that this particular person, Boyan Gerasimov, was the director of policy to the Minister of Procurement in the middle of the pandemic, and that he is a McKinsey alum. Madam Auditor, just in the time I have left, I note in your report, 45% of the contracts examined lacked sufficient documentation to justify the need for a contract. So in almost half of the cases of these contracts, there wasn't even evidence or sufficient evidence that there was any reason for the contract to happen in the first place, which is quite staggering in light of $200 million in contracts. Anything more you can share about that 45% figure and what it reveals?
Well, for me, it reveals that at the start, everyone should be taking a step back before they enter into a procurement process. You need to figure out if you are trying to fill a skills gap that doesn't exist in the public service, whether you need additional resources, or if you're just trying to get, plurality of thought and trying to get something outside the public service to compare to. Once you've justified that, then you make an estimate for what you think you're willing to spend for that. Those are all requirements that are in the procurement policies that exist now, and then go out and get a contract. I would expect that the default would be competitive unless there's a justification for non-competitive.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Auditor General, and your team for this major undertaking. And I've had the opportunity to, we have here in this committee and other committees, look at a number of contracts and the vast expanse of contracts that are out there and how they're looked at, how they're done, and we've had the opportunity to go back as far as 20 years. Some witnesses have indicated that the procurement process hasn't really changed much. And then there's also the issue of I think in some of your findings where there's a lot of familiarity amongst contractors, subcontractors, and it may be something that has become practice where the familiarity may be a reason why things are overlooked. It's some things that we've seen, and there's been and you've mentioned there's a frequent disregard of rules applied, and that may be some of it because of that. So my question is, you also talked about people moving around, changing of roles is very frequent, and there can be gaps there. And then, is the work being passed along to some other people that are just coming into picking up a file and then saying, and not knowing what processes have been gone through and how do you verify those kinds of things? So I'm just looking at all of those challenges that can happen in such a huge departmental responsibilities that do occur. So I think PC with the question around PSPC suspending departments and agencies delegated authority for professional services contracts in November of last year, while new procedures and training were put in place. I'm not sure you have had a chance to evaluate these measures yet, but when do you believe we will get a sense of whether those are working, those new measures that have been put in place?
I mean, I think you've raised other possibilities for why the behavior that we're seeing might be happening. And I think that's why the public service needs to take a step back and figure out what it is about procurement rules that are driving the behaviors that we're seeing. The changes that were brought about after the audit period, I have not had an opportunity to look at. I believe removing the delegated authority of a department is one way to ensure that Public Service and Procurement Canada can play a bigger a challenge function and a more important role in that department's procurement strategy. So I would expect that they would be able to comment on how quickly they will see improvements or changes with the new rules that are there. I think the one rule that I really appreciate is where someone in charge of a procurement will have to certify that they've done certain key steps. For me, that's the great reminder that is needed about the existing rules and how they should be applied.
Okay, when it comes to the now defunct National Master Standing Offer mechanism, the government's working on a replacement for that. What are some of the characteristics you would hope to see in there?
Well, if you look back to what a national master standing offer is meant for, it's meant to provide a group of services that are commonly purchased in a certain format. I guess I would call it almost like a vending machine, right? There's certain things you can get, and you decide how often you want or how many you want of one item. I would expect that a national master standing offer list would be created through a competitive process instead of a non-competitive process. While both are allowed under the existing rules, I always default to competition should bring about the best value for Canadians, and when possible, that process should be run in that way. So I would like to see that. I would then hope that PSPC would ensure that none of the call-ups against those national master standing offers would include services outside of the ones that are allowed for under the offer.
And you indicated that you didn't see any political interference in these decisions, and the ultimate responsibility should lie with the deputy heads of each department. And so how can government simplify the process to provide accountability and also streamline the process?
I think as Andrew responded before in expanding the answer, a deputy head is ultimately through legislation the accounting officer of an organization and are ultimately accountable for all of the decisions that are made. That is delegated down through the organization. Everyone who has delegated authority has training to do about what it means. And I think everyone needs to recognize that signing off or committing the government to a contract, signing off on the use of public funds comes with accountability. So it does have to be a culture throughout the organization, every organization, about making sure that there's prudent use of public funds.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brock, please.
And thank you, Auditor General, for your attendance and your team as well. I'm going to preface my questions with a comment. And since you released your reports, three reports last week, I've heard from hundreds of Canadians who have expressed their profound disappointment in this NDP-Liberal government that over the course of almost 9 years consistently demonstrate a lack of adherence to basic procurement rules. And to your point in this particular audit is you focus in on whether or not procurement, in this case to McKinsey, provided value for money for Canadians. And I take a look at your overall message, and you indicate quite clearly that federal contracting and procurement policies exist to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians, but they only work if they are followed. So I'm hearing that, yes, the auditor is making recommendations, and the department heads and organizations are saying, yes, we'll agree to follow those recommendations. But they already know what the rules are, and they're not following it. And every audit that I have been privy to from your office consistently shows a pattern of disrespect for taxpayer monies. So the question to you is, how do you define value for money from an auditor's perspective?
So that's not always a simple question to answer. In this case, we did outline in our audit report, I'm just trying to find the paragraph for you, it's paragraph 28, where we listed elements that we were searching for to demonstrate value for money. I would have told you that value for money during the pandemic might have been evaluated in a slightly different way than it should be evaluated in the normal course of business. But we would have expected that departments would have clearly articulated the need for a contract, what the expected deliverables were, whether all the deliverables had been provided, and whether or not the ultimate intent of that contract, so the outcome, was achieved. So more than half, one or more of those, we could not see being demonstrated.
The Government of Canada has published on its website that it must adhere to 4 fundamental principles of financial management. 1, value for money. 2, accountability. 3, transparency. And 4, risk management. Government of Canada defines value for money as follows: that public funds, taxpayer monies, are managed with prudence and probity. Assets are safeguarded and resources are used effectively, efficiently, and economically to achieve departmental and governmental objectives. A very specific definition. So I know that you've indicated last week that your mandate, and you've indicated this numerous times, your mandate is also to refer criminality, should you suspect criminality, to the appropriate authorities. And I believe you indicated when a question was put to you whether you discovered any element of criminality. I want to confirm a couple of things. Your threshold for referrals is based on suspicion and suspicion only. Is that correct?
I mean, it is very rare that we would refer something to the RCMP or to law enforcement before our work is made public, but we're always happy to talk to the RCMP once it's out there, but we have not made a referral in this case.
Do you agree that the government of Canada holds its position as a trustee over public funds? Do you agree with that statement?
That it holds its position?
That it performs the role as a trustee over public funds. Do you agree with that statement?
I agree that it should be using public funds in a way that brings the best value to Canadians.
Okay.
Absolutely.
You don't agree that they hold a trust relationship with Canadians?
Well, absolutely. Every individual should trust its government.
Which brings me to a potential criminal charge of breach of trust under section 336 of the Criminal Code, a straight indictable offense punishable by a maximum of 14 years. The elements are there that potentially someone who made the decision to favor McKinsey on a broad range of departments and crown corporations could be held liable for the actions that they took. So, did you direct your mind at all to the potential that there should be a breach of trust investigation by appropriate law enforcement?
Very brief answer.
Given the origin of this audit, we were looking for whether or not there was direction or political interference. We did not see it in this audit. If there was a concern around improper use of public funds in a way that could have been criminal, we would have referred it to the RCMP.
I'm afraid that is our
Position of
time, Mr.
authority,
Brock.
though?
That is our time, I'm afraid. Mr. Kuzmirchuk?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to along those same lines of what my colleague had stated, we are absolutely always concerned about making sure that public funds are used appropriately, which is why we were so disappointed that the Conservative Party was using tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of public funds for political events to pay for the travel of themselves and their spouses to political caucuses, which everyone knows is absolutely wrong. So I just wanted to get that on the record. Ms. Hogan, we know how important the independence of your office is to do your work. And we know that it's important. This allows your work to move forward unimpeded. Last week, the Conservatives put forward a motion requiring your office to produce documents in your possession. And so I wanted to ask you, how does ordering your office to do this impact your ability to fulfill your mandate and conduct your audits?
So I believe that the member, Mr. Chair, is referring to the motion in the House that is, I think, being voted on later on today. In my view, in my opinion, including my office in that motion was unnecessary. I made it clear last week that I would cooperate with the RCMP if they felt it necessary to come to my office and ask for information. We have a well-established procedure that has worked effectively in the past, which includes them providing me with a production order should they want to have access to my files. I believe that the motion does impede on my independence in that I don't need to go through the law clerk. I have a proven track record that I am cooperative and supportive with parliamentarians, and that I would cooperate very swiftly with the RCMP if the need arose.
I very much appreciate your response. And Madam Auditor General, I just wanted to say, all of us here on this side of the table so appreciate your work. We trust the work that you do. It's very important. And I wanted to say thank you for your time here today at committee. We are listening very attentively to what you are bringing forward here. Unfortunately, my colleague, conservative colleague across the way, is tweeting on social media as we speak while you are giving your testimony here, which I think shows you just how seriously or unseriously they're taking your testimony here today. I wanted to ask you as well, Madam Auditor General, you mentioned the fact that you looked at 97 contracts. 97 contracts. You only found one contract where there was any ministerial involvement, and that's simply because the value of the contract exceeded a certain threshold. What percentage of the contracts you looked at had zero ministerial or political involvement? What percentage?
Well, if it's 1 out of 97, not a calculator, but I'm going to go with almost 99% of those contracts did not involve ministerial interference.
That is 99% did not have any ministerial involvement. I really do appreciate you providing that information for us. And I do hope that that information makes it to my conservative colleagues' social media platform, because that is important information to know. Also wanted to ask you, why do some, because you talked about what is driving the behavior of public officials, public servants, why do some public officials keep going back to the same well in terms of a certain company or a certain contract?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I think we saw in some of the contracts that we reviewed that they felt that once one contract had been issued, there was McKinsey had a knowledge of the business that then would justify that they would be more efficient and effective in future contracts. But I think that could be said about any vendor, which is why I do believe that the first requirement to determine exactly what you're hoping to accomplish with a procurement process is well thought through, well documented, and then you pick the most appropriate tool that is available. Sometimes they are competitive and sometimes they are not, in order to accomplish that outcome.
And you mentioned the fact that Natural Resources Department was one of the departments that had a clean bill of health. Are you able to provide us, what did they do well? I mean, we looked at, in your report, you talked about what the other departments did not do so well. Do we know what Natural Resources did well?
Well, I'm going to give a really quick answer and see if Nick wants to add, but I would say follow the rules well.
That was my answer, AG. Mr. Swells, if you have a brief response.
I have nothing specific to add beyond that. That was what they did.
Okay, great. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Hogan, I'd like to come back to something you were saying earlier. You spoke about benchmarking and said that sometimes you need people from the private sector to provide that comparative analysis, that benchmarking. Now, out of the 349,000 public servants we have, there are many who have come from the private sector. Why wouldn't you call on their expertise? Why wouldn't one call upon their expertise? That's my first question. My second question is this. You also stated that we have a perfect opportunity to learn, but this isn't the first report that you have done and that others have done on procurement. And Canada hasn't been awarding contracts only recently. So how is it that over the years, over the decades, Canada hasn't figured out how to solve these recurring procurement problems in terms of supporting documents, justifying each stage? So I'm really flabbergasted that after all this time and after all this experience, we're still at the point where decisions are not being supported. Can you explain that? Well, I'm a little perplexed as well, because it seems to me that these are basic rules that should be followed when it comes to contracting. Your first question had to do with why we're not relying on expertise within the public service. And I really think that this would be a question that would have to be asked of each department, each Crown corporation, because some do this well and some don't do it as well. I mean, if you look at those 97 contracts that were awarded, well, that doesn't necessarily give a complete picture of the entire government for every and each decision. In my opinion, there are several rules and there's also a turnover of employees. So there has to be ongoing training. I know we do this within our office, but if an individual is going to award a contract or is going to be responsible for awarding contracts, and if it's not something they do on a daily basis, they should have that training. Because the reflex should be to go back to those basic rules and follow them.
Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, in the 4 of the 28 contracts in which the process appeared to be designed and implemented to favor McKinsey, I'm wondering if your office could provide the committee with some direction as to who we might call before the committee to ask about the reasons for those decisions.
I guess we could give you the names of the departments that were involved in those, and then
Like it requires a bit of forensic work on our part to
Mhm.
figure out which individuals were actually involved. And I think getting to the bottom of the motivation is really a key step in order to fix it.
Mhm.
Are all 4 of them McKinsey alum? Do any of the 4 of them actually understand the rules that they were supposed to be following? Like, these are all questions that I think are probably relevant to trying to fix plug the hole in the ship. Is that information that your office can provide?
Well, Mr. Chair, we can provide the departments involved in those 4 contracts and the dates of those 4 contracts. I think one of my previous comments where there are 97 here and there's probably 97 unique differences. And I think that's something to bear in mind as you go through this. Every contract has some uniqueness or some story around it.
And then your comment about having a checklist essentially to have each individual who's responsible for the procurement process go through a checklist and make an attestation that they followed all the required steps. Like, it seems like such a simple fix, and like I find it a bit bewildering that these are individuals, some of whom are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure that the public gets value for money and that all the rules are followed, and they need a checklist to make sure that they didn't skip any steps. And it seems like they're not even aware the steps exist. If the fix is so simple as a simple checklist, why wasn't this done years and years ago?
Well, the comment I made is one that actually was just implemented, I believe, by Public Service and Procurement Canada, or from Treasury Board. It was actually from Treasury Board. It was an announcement that those were some of the strengths brought to the procurement process. And I think that just reflects on the complexity of all of the rules that exist. There are many, it's not just Treasury Board policies, there's trade agreements. There are so many things that need to be factored in to a procurement process. That it does require at times, I think, a bit of an aide-mémoire, especially if it's not something that you do every day. And that's why I would encourage every organization to make sure they involve their own procurement branch in addition to Public Service and Procurement Canada if needed.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Hogan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. Ms. Cusi, you have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I'm going to go back to the National Master Standing Offers. So a National Master Standing Offer was granted to McKinsey in 2021 in a non-competitive process. This was not properly justified and ended up costing a total of $42.4 million. The call-ups issued under the unjustified offer were also unjustified. How does the justification process need to be reformed to ensure competitive processes are honored?
I think one point to clarify here is that the National Master Standing Offer was done in a non-competitive way. While Public Service and Procurement Canada provided a justification, we felt it was rather weak. Then the next step is where I think confusion existed when there were 19 call-ups against the National Master Standing Offer. I think the organizations felt that they were using a procurement vehicle that was at their disposal, and that they didn't need to justify why they were using that vehicle. But when you realize that that is the first time a contract is being issued between the government and McKinsey, the non-competitive contracting rules kick in, and there should have been a well-documented rationale for why that National Master Standing Offer versus another.
In your opinion, why do you think some departments are capable of contracting according to government standards, but Procurement Canada, the body in charge of procurement, seems to struggle in this area?
I think Public Service and Procurement Canada issue many contracts. They were not involved in all 97 here, but what we found is that they could have done a better job challenging. And I think that's one of the big questions that the public service needs to ask itself is, what is it about the rules that's causing this behavior? Because the rules, in my view, are rather clear. While there are many, they are rather clear.
Clearly, it's the government. Why was a minister's signature required for a $5 million contract, but not any of the other of the massive contracts, that were granted to McKinsey?
In the case where the minister was involved, the contract was being issued on a non-competitive basis, and there's a certain threshold that the public service can no longer authorize a non-competitive contract. I think it's $4.5 million. And that's why a minister needed to be involved, because it was non-competitive versus competitive.
The justification provided was challenged by procurement officials before the minister signed off and agreed to the call-up. Is it concerning that a minister personally signed a contract that her own officials challenged? Have you seen this elsewhere?
I'm going to see if Nick wants to add something here, but it's my understanding that the minister did not actually sign the contract. They just provided authority to exceed the limit allowed by the public service. He's nodding in agreement.
That's great.
So.
I'll turn to contract chains now. A practice you discovered is that a small non-competitive contract would be granted to a department as it fell below the threshold that requires a competitive process. Once this contract was awarded, departments would argue that future contracts had to be done through McKinsey as they had already begun the work. How common is this practice across government departments?
I don't think I can answer how common it is across all of government departments. We saw in this case, out of the 97 contracts, 4 chains. Those 4 chains involved 30 of the 97 contracts, but I'm not sure that that can be extrapolated across all government contracts.
Should small contracts have rules about future contracting, in your opinion?
I think then it comes back down to what was supposed to be the bigger, broader procurement process. It comes back to that initial question of what was the need that you were trying to meet, or what service were you trying to get, and then figuring out the right procurement process. I believe that the way these chains were structured did not favor value for money and likely limited competition. I believe that if you give Andrew a couple seconds, he might like to add something.
I would just add that it doesn't make sense to us that a small dollar value contract would be the basis upon which you could exercise a future justification for non-competitive. For example, that it's not in the public interest to compete it when it's only been a minor, small amount of investment at that point in time.
So there's nothing in place currently that prevents these types of contracting chains.
We would consider those kind of justifications to be weak. They shouldn't be the reason for proceeding with a non-competitive contract in those cases. The rules are clear, but the application is where it falls down.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Susa, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and providing your comments on the report, as well as other reports. And I think it's important to state that this is not something new, right? This is not something that's been unique, because you've had a number of opportunities to review procurement, review the status of some of the work that's being done across the board, not just with McKinsey, and you've made some great recommendations thus far. Has has the government adopted your recommendations that you've made up to this point?
I mean, if you're talking over the years that my office has done procurement audits, absolutely, they have adopted them. In this case, I only issued one recommendation because I felt that the procurement ombuds and the Controller General and the internal audit shops who had done work from March of 2023 until very recently had addressed all of the other concerns. But again, I just want to reiterate, I don't think it's about creating more rules. I think it's about understanding the existing rules and why they're not being applied.
What I'm getting at is there's a great desire by government and those civil servants who have done an extraordinary job on many contracts beyond just the ones you've seen. And they too, I believe, have a concern to ensure transparency and integrity and fairness is built into the system. Like, do you have any doubt that they're not cooperating or they would not like to see things improve?
I think throughout any audit that we have, and especially recently where we've looked at procurements, the public servants who are in the actual procurement groups across the federal public service take such pride in the work that they do and the advice that they try to give. So I don't, believe here that this was done in an intentional way. And that's why I say it's important for the public service to sit back and understand what's driving the behavior that we're seeing.
And I think this is what I'm trying to reinforce. Obviously, there's a narrative here that was some nefarious activity. People are getting, taking favors, whatever that is. Like, I want to make certain that there was no criminality here, right? Did any three of you see any criminal integrity or criminal activity, or were there issues of nefarious activity? Explain to me if you see any interference in the system.
So we did not see anything that rose to the level that we felt we should raise concerns to the RCMP. But I am not law enforcement. They are welcome to read my report and come talk to us about any of the examples that we provided.
This committee wants to make certain that there is no activity as such. We want to make certain that there is no coordinated effort. We want to make certain that there is every step being taken to provide fairness and transparency to the system. The government's adopting recommendations. They're enacting some of the suggestions being made. A pandemic happened, which also took things off the rails. There's a lot of work and a lot of issues, but were there criminal activities? Were there any elected officials that were interfering? I know the members on the opposite side, I mean, even the leader of the opposition at the time, they stood to support one of the ministers that was charged, or that was initiated with conflicts of interest during a procurement in, I believe, with the Minister of Parry Sound, Muskoka at the time. We got to make certain that we don't have those repeats, and we want to make certain that there is no suggestion of such.
Point of order, Chair.
Yeah, I'll stop the clock. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Chair, I just, it seems the member for gas plants is just making things up.
First of all, before you continue, let's not use such stuff. Continue, please. That's it.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, what I'm trying to get to is to ensure that there is integrity and transparency and fairness. And I'm not looking at accusing anyone. I'm just making certain that people are operating effectively and that those proper steps are being taken.
I mean, I'm not sure what more I could offer than my previous questions, that we did not see ministerial interference in any of the contracts, that the review of these 97 contracts did not raise concerns that we felt were of a nature that we should refer to the RCMP. This is a question of understanding the rigor that is needed around Government of Canada procurements to demonstrate value for money to Canadians.
Which contracts exist beyond just the McKinsey? Like to what's the size and scope relative to what you've reviewed versus what actually happens?
So I think it's important to highlight that we looked at just the professional services that would have fallen under the types of services that McKinsey could provide. We've included some graphs in our report that we thought would help give a sense of where the McKinsey contracts fit in the bigger, broader Government of Canada procurement of professional services. Over the 12 years that we looked at, the government spent about $68 billion on professional services. 200 or so million of that was McKinsey, which represented 0.27% of what was spent on procurement. That's why when we see that there was a frequent disregard for the rules, we have for McKinsey, we don't believe that it's reasonable to assume it's limited just to them, that it is likely that it's time to remind all public servants involved in procurement what the rules are and why they're there, so that they can be followed and that documentation will exist to demonstrate that probity and prudence, prudent use of public funds was present.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair. To be really clear, this report was initiated by the revelation of the sudden sharp increase of contracts that McKinsey received once this Liberal government took power. And I'll reiterate, from 2011 to 2015, McKinsey received $8.6 million in contracts. From 2015 onwards, under this Liberal government, they received $191 million, a much higher number than was previously reported. So while I agree that it is perhaps a bellwether of what is happening across departments writ large when it comes to a blatant disregard for the rules when it comes to contracting, we did see a very sharp increase in contracts to one individual company. Prior to this audit, we found there was a personal connection between McKinsey and the Liberals. In fact, it was Dominic Barton, the head of McKinsey, who was the brain behind the creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. You found in your audit that the Canada Infrastructure Bank gave 2 contracts to McKinsey with no evaluation criteria in the request for bids or in those evaluations. Did the Canada Infrastructure Bank have any explanation for this?
I'm going to have to ask Nick if he can provide some additional details on that.
So the scenarios they were working with was that so this gets a bit complicated. Sometimes in RFPs and so on, you have there are provisions that they don't necessarily have to follow very precisely the evaluation structure that they set up, and so that was the case with these ones in the competitive realm. Our concern was that this was not well documented.
Thank you very much. You also raised some serious privacy and security concerns in your audit. You found that in one case, IRCC gave 5 contractors access to their network without the proper security clearances. What sort of information would these contractors have had access to on IRCC's network? Would this have included sensitive personal information of Canadians? And then what other instances were there of contractors doing work or being given access to sensitive information without the proper security clearances? Were there other departments?
So when it came to the issue with Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, I actually spoke with the Deputy Minister myself. He assured me that the individuals in question didn't access anyone's personal information. I would have been concerned around applications from individuals seeking either residency or work permits here in Canada. When we looked at the security, we found that in the contracts that we sampled, there was 17 that required security clearances in order for the work to be done, recognizing that this is only in the contracts from the departments and agencies, because that's where the government security policy kicks in. We found that about 76% of them couldn't demonstrate to us that the individuals who were going to do the work had the required clearances before that work began. So that is very concerning. It doesn't mean they didn't have a clearance, but what it means is that the individuals managing the procurement process did not have that on file and had not done that work. And that is a requirement. That is an important rule that really should have been followed.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Baines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna just go into the your work with the Office of the Procurement Ombuds, in addition to the internal reviews by departments, agencies, and some crown corporations, your office and the Office of the Procurement Ombud each published reports on federal contracts awarded to McKinsey. How did your work with the Procurement Ombud for this report? How did you work with them?
So I might see if Nick wants to add anything, but we did not work with the procurement ombuds. We were aware of each other's reviews. We were both responding to requests for work. Mine was from a unanimous motion from the House of Commons, and his was from a different source. He looks at very specific compliance with procurement rules. And then we were able to bring in the Crown. So we were the first organization able to bring in the Crown since no one else could look at the Crowns. What we found is our findings were very similar, and that's why we outlined what some of the recommendations were coming out of the procurement ombuds as well as the internal audit shops, and that's why we didn't repeat any recommendations. We felt that answers had already been provided. So Nick, I don't know if you wanted to expand at all on how you interacted with the procurement ombuds.
I would just add that we did talk to them frequently as they were drawing their conclusions, and asked them, and they provided us with information about what they were seeing on individual contracts, which we then verified against the information that we had to ensure that we had the same understanding of the situation.
The respective mandates ultimately, instead of differentiating things, they were able to find similarities. And in your opinion, was it valuable to have like two arm lengths offices report on the same topic? Why or why not?
What I would tell you that you had actually many independent parties reporting on this. The Controller General would have asked all of the internal audit shops to do work. So where we could, we relied on that work and used some of that work. Then you would have had the procurement ombuds, and then there was my office. I think the uniqueness that I was able to bring is I was the only organization that looked at determining whether value for money had been achieved. But then I am also the only one allowed to audit the Crown corporations and was able to bring them into the story. Up until then, it was just departments and agencies.
You indicated three right there. Were there other? You said many. Were there other offices that were?
Well, the Controller General reached out to all 10 departments and agencies that indicated that they had contracts with McKinsey and Company, and provided them with an audit program that the internal audit shop had to, at a minimum, carry out in addition to whatever other work they may have wanted to do around the procurement process. So every department's internal audit shop is supposed to be independent of the organization and reports directly to the deputy head on what they find when they do audit work within the department or agency.
So we can be assured that this process was quite thorough.
I can tell you for sure that our process was quite thorough. We did review some of the work of the internal audit shops and relied on some of their work. So some of their work was excellent, and we were able to use it and add to it where we needed to when it came to determining value for money.
I'm going to point to just one area where it says, noting that the other reviews had provided recommendations with similar themes which you support, your report makes a single recommendation, and it's, quote, in the area of conflicts of interest that you believe was not addressed by previous recommendations, end quote. In your view, why might reviews conducted internally or by the procurement ombud not included recommendations addressing conflict of interest?
Perhaps they weren't looking for it, but in my view, given the renewed conversation about values and ethics and conflict of interest across the public service, I felt it was important to ensure that conflicts of interest were well managed, especially when I recognize the source of the motion that was passed in the House for me to do this work. So we felt that there was an area where we saw some of the Crown corporations just doing a really good proactive job at self-declaring on whether it was competitive or non-competitive processes when it came to conflicts of interest, whereas the public service was relying on the annual declaration. And I felt that that was a gap, and it was important to close that gap, because making sure that everyone involved in the procurement process has thought through whether they may be in a real or perceived position of conflict of interest was important in order to ensure the fairness of procurement processes.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, 45% of the contracts with McKinsey are lacking one or more supporting documents. Now, from what I recall, the Government of Canada annually awards about 400,000 contracts. 35% is 185 contracts that may actually be lacking these justificating or supporting documents. So can you actually, can you use that as an example and expand it to the entire public service? Well, I think I'm just going to adjust that percentage. We took a sample of 33 contracts out of 97. And that is statistically significant. So yes, you could extrapolate from that for professional services. I think it's important to specify that you have to extrapolate over the same population. 58% of those contracts showed that there were one or more gaps, and one of those gaps was a lack of an explanation of why the contract was needed. Now, I know that's a lot of percentages, but I think it's pretty important. So in more than half of the cases, there were one or more gaps that prevented us from determining whether there was a value for money in those contracts. Thank you. There's something else I'm concerned about. It was the issue of accountability was raised earlier, but there's also a fear on the part, perhaps, of public service of being wrapped on the knuckles, and there's a fear of change. So if you're going to, in quotation marks, threaten indirectly reprisals for every little mistake that might be made, do you think that that actually hinders accountability? Well, that's an excellent question. You know, there are so many individuals who speak to our teams during an audit, and sometimes they, yes, are afraid of reprisals. It happens. And from time to time, they're a little concerned about sharing information with us, but they do know that we will consider it. So I actually do appreciate that commitment on the part of public service when we are doing these audits, but there are many reasons that may explain why the rules aren't followed. And it really is up to each and every department and Crown Corporation and agency to determine what it is within their culture that can explain why the rules aren't being followed.
Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, one of the more troubling inclusions in your report is this piece around the use of Crown corporations as proxies. And you've noted that for one contract that was issued by the Canada Development Investment Corporation at the request of the Department of Finance, that, quote, the department's approach raises the perception that it used the Crown Corporation as a proxy to avoid the public service's competitive procurement requirements. What requirements might they have been trying to avoid?
This is one of those complex situations. As I said, 97 contracts, almost 97 different situations. CDEV provides advice to the Department of Finance. That is one of their raison d'être. And what we found here is that the Department of Finance was very involved in a procurement process when they typically would not have been. They provided a statement of work. They were part of the evaluation committee. And that perception is one that made it look like they were trying to avoid certain rules. In the Crown's case, a competitive process would have just been to ask 3 different vendors for bids. In the federal department's case, this would have involved a much lengthier process of having the contract available for all Canadians to bid on, then doing an evaluation of all of those bids. So it's likely faster that you only have to go to 3 vendors and then evaluate the bids received and issue the contract.
So given the perception that this was done to avoid a more rigorous procurement process and more rigorous rules, what can be done in order to prevent that from happening? Assuming that the more rigorous process is in the public interest, I'm wondering if the steps the government has taken to strengthen procurement address this specific situation that you've raised here.
I can tell you that I spoke with both the head of CDEV and the Deputy Minister of Finance about this situation specifically, and some of our concerns were that the Department of Finance should have been further withdrawn. They didn't need to provide the statement of work. They didn't need to go get a contract to get advice. They could have said, we need advice in a certain topic. Can you provide it to us? And then leave the Crown to determine the best way to get access to that. So it's that perception of being a little more involved that is the one that we questioned here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Genuis for 5, please.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Auditor General, again, just kind of summarizing your report here on McKinsey contracting with this current NDP-Liberal government. Your frustration seems to kind of exude through the pages in a few ways. I note, for instance, on the recommendation side, you basically said, well, many of the recommendations you've made on previous reports would have relevance to this report, so you're not going to repeat them. Fixing the problems is a simple matter of adhering to the rules, and you note that it's not complicated. There are rules in place. The rules are just not being followed. And it highlights the fact that pointing out the problems is one thing, but the government has to actually be serious about implementing the solutions. And I guess it's frustrating for me to hear the discourse in response to your reports is always very, very deferential publicly from the government, saying, oh, we listened, we thank the Auditor General for her work, etc. But then there was a failure to implement the basic solutions, and we have a situation where you have a report coming back saying, essentially, I don't need to repeat myself, refer to previous reports for recommendations that would have addressed many of these problems. What can be done to get at this core issue of maybe governments paying lip service to recommendations you've made, but then not taking their implementation seriously?
So just a small point of clarification in this report, I wasn't referring to our previous recommendations, but those that the procurement ombuds had just recently issued, as well as the internal audit departments and the Controller General. So when it comes to following the recommendations that we give and actually implementing them, I wish I had the solution, because we often hear, yes, we agree, and then don't see action. But I have to say, following ArriveCan and throughout this audit, we saw that Treasury Board and Public Service and Procurement Canada were already making changes. So that's a positive. What I'm hoping we'll see going forward is that it isn't just a one and done, that there is a recognition that the reminder about procurement rules should happen on a regular basis. And that's why I do believe that every organization needs to make sure that they have better monitoring or better quality control system over all of this. Because while the rules may be confusing at times, they are very clear, and it's how they're applied and then well documented that should be improved.
Yeah. Yeah, it is frustrating, I think, to many Canadians that after 9 years of this government, the simple matter of you've got to follow the rules, and the rules aren't being followed, and where improvement is characterized as, okay, well, we're going to work harder to follow the existing rules. We're not even talking about existing rules being inadequate. We're talking about a failure to adhere to rules. In the time I have left, I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Kusi. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Auditor General. Again, I think given this damning report, Mr. Chair, I'm going to launch into a motion that I've submitted to the clerk. Ça existe dans les deux langues officielles.
And it's in both official languages.
It's evident that more needs to be uncovered after this report, with where it was determined that there was frequent disregard for the rules of contracting. And again, we see the same players complicit, with 70% of the contracts, that's $118 million, being non-competitive. 4 out of 28 being designed to suit McKinsey, 10 out of 28 contracts where there was not enough documentation, 17 out of 20 departments failing to meet these requirements, 18 out of 19 being off a national master standoff list. That's 76%, which did not have good enough justification. 13 out of 17 not having the correct security clearance requirements. 6 out of 23, that's 22%, did not receive all of the deliverables. And as I said, only 29% through a competitive process. In addition to this motion, which I'm putting forward, Mr. Chair, we see these in incredible amounts. Immigration, refugees, and Citizenship Canada, close to $25 million over 2 contracts. National Defense, $26 million almost over 15 contracts. Public Services and Procurement, more than $26 million over 3 contracts. I will say my counterpart, the president of Treasury Board, her fingerprints are all over this, Mr. Chair. Business Development Bank of Canada, Crown Corporations, which were just brought up, 11 contracts for close to $22 million. Canada Post, whom we just had in here in this committee recently, almost $27 million over 14 contracts. Public Sector Pension Investment Board, over $14 million of contracts, over 18 contracts awarded there. And a single contract, Mr. Chair, awarded to Trans Mountain Corporation. As an Albertan, I'm not surprised by this at all. And with that, I will get into the wording of the contract. And that is, Mr. Chair, I will read it into the record in English.
Can I interrupt before you do?
Yep.
I think we will, because of the time, just excuse our witnesses. I don't foresee us getting to the next round. Thank you, as always, Mr. Hayes, E.G. Hogan, Mr. Sways, Mr. Mariani. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks very much. Sorry, Mrs. Lucy, continue.
Thank you very much. The motion reads as follows. That in relation to the committee's study of government contracting with McKinsey, the committee invites Dominique Barton, former global managing partner of McKinsey, Bob Sternfels, current global managing partner of McKinsey, Boyan Gerasimov, former engagement manager of McKinsey and former director of policy to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, the McKinsey Canada officials responsible for securing government contracts, the president of the Treasury Board and department officials, the Minister of Public Service and Procurement and department officials, Department of National Defense officials, Department of Immigration officials, Business Development Bank of Canada officials, Export Development Canada officials, Public Sector Pension Investment Board officials, Trans Mountain Corporation executives, Mr. Chair, and finally, Canada Infrastructure Bank officials. So as I said, Mr. Chair, we have just seen a damning report delivered by the Auditor General here this last week, and we must uncover more. Even she did not have the answers for us today. Even she said that we need to have more information in an effort to really solve both the incompetence as well as further explore the cozy relationship between the Liberal government and McKinsey. We need to get to the bottom of this. And so with that, I am putting forward this motion today. I am moving this motion today, which calls these witnesses in an effort to do that, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We'll start debate. Mr. Kusmirchuk and then Mr. Genuis.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And, everyone around this table takes this issue incredibly seriously. We asked the Auditor General to come here and provide a testimony here today of her exceptional work. We're very grateful for the work that she and her team has brought forward. This is obviously a serious issue. We absolutely want to strengthen accountability in our public service and our public officials and their day-to-day work. We want to see compliance of procurement rules strengthened. We want to see improvements made in quality control in the work that our public servants do. And we want to see above all, which is something, again, a common theme that we have seen whether it's the Auditor General's report, whether it's the Procurement Ombudsman's report, the thread that has connected all of those investigations and analyses is we need to drastically improve documentation. I mean, documentation. That's the thread and the theme that really has been repeated over and over through these analyses. But what we heard today loud and clear from the Auditor General is that 99% of the contracts that were studied had no political involvement whatsoever. So there were 97 contracts that the Auditor General looked at. And we asked the Auditor General point blank, out of the 97 contracts, how many had political involvement? And the Auditor General clearly stated that there was only one out of 97 that had ministerial involvement. And that was because the contract had exceeded a certain or met a certain threshold where that was required. So 99% had no political involvement. That means no ministers were involved, no members of parliament were involved, no elected officials were involved. This is an issue within the unelected public service and the public sector. Again, compliance with procurement rules, improving quality control, improving documentation. This is the task eternal of the public service. This is something that not only every public servant in Canada, this is an ongoing eternal task, but this is something that every public service in the world, this is the challenge that they face. This is the struggle. And so, the questions that are before us is what we can do. How do we help our public servants be the best that they possibly can be, deliver the best service that they possibly can be? How do they maintain the rigor that is required of their work? How do they maintain the highest professionalism? That's the fundamental question. It's not a question of politics. It's a question of professionalism, public service professionalism. And how do we help our public servants make sure that they meet and exceed the highest level of public service professionalism? That's what this is about. And this is what this conversation is about. Now, my experience working alongside public servants is that they are incredibly dedicated people. The highest professionalism. And they are dedicated, they are professional, they take their work extremely seriously. And they take the integrity of their work and their office extremely seriously. And we saw that, especially during the trying times of COVID and the pandemic. These were unheralded heroes that often worked behind the scenes, out of the limelight, long hours, long weekends to help get this country through the pandemic and COVID. These are exceptional professionals. And the question that is before us again is how do we help them? How do we help our public servants or unelected public officials maintain the highest vigor and rigor of highest standards of professionalism? That's what this is about. This is what we heard the Auditor General say over and over, that there was no malfeasance, there was no any type of untoward motivation, but that there were gaps in the systems that do absolutely need to be addressed. Because again, we heard today as well too, that the federal government procures billions, tens of billions of dollars of goods and services every single year, hundreds of thousands of contracts. I think I heard, 400,000 contracts every year. And it is important, it is critical that we have the proper airtight systems in place to make sure that Canadians are getting the best value for money, that every dollar is spent wisely. But at the same time, we need the proper documentation to be able to show our work, to be able to show the work, I should say, of our public servants, so that when there are mistakes that are made, we can learn from them. And also so that we can, again, take the necessary lessons from it and learn best practices from it. That's absolutely important. So value for money is absolutely critical. But we also know for sure that in those instances where someone does do something that's untoward, that we can hold them accountable, And that is something that is absolutely critical. But we heard loud and clear today from the Auditor General. It couldn't be more clear. The Auditor General looked at 97 contracts within 10 departments and within 10 Crown agencies, and found that out of the 97 contracts, there was zero involvement from elected officials, zero involvement from ministers, from members of parliament, from elected officials, except for one. 98%, 98.9%, 99% of contracts that they looked at had zero ministerial or political interference. And so this was an issue. This is an issue of that is within our public officials, our public service. And we need to find out how do we help our public service be the best version of themselves that they possibly absolutely can be. And what we heard today, on top of all that, the Auditor General was absolutely clear. The rules already exist. The rules already exist. The framework of accountability and the framework of rules and systems already exist. This is what we heard. But that what needs to change is that the departments need to make sure the deputy ministers, the unelected officials, needs to make sure that the rules are being followed. And we heard today that there are varying degrees of compliance with those rules. Some departments are better than others. So we need to make sure, how do we follow the leaders and not the laggards? And how do we make sure that the best practices are adhered to by every public official in every department? We heard natural resources is a department that had a clean sheet, a clean bill of health from the Auditor General. What do they do that's different that other departments and Crown agencies need to emulate to make sure that they're doing the right things? This is important, but that change, that culture change, that change is the responsibility of the unelected public service, and bringing that to bear is absolutely important, and it is something that is important to us as elected officials to make sure that there is accountability in that system. But as the Auditor General said, the rules exist, the accountability framework exists. It's a matter of departments and Crown agencies. It's a matter of Crown agencies and departments following those rules, which is what is important. And we're also in this conversation, we also learned the complexity that public servants have to deal with. And we heard about the need to balance. Again, it's not about creating more red tape. I mean, we're doing a red tape reduction study in this committee. It's not about creating more rules or more red tape. It is about balancing the need for accountability 100%, but balancing that also with the need for efficiency to make sure that decisions can be made in a manner that is responsible, that is accountable, but that is also efficient, so that the work of government can continue, and so that Canadians can receive the service that they require. And so that's where we should be taking this next step as a committee. We heard it loud and clear. the Auditor General pointed us in the right direction, which is the need to speak with officials, the need for us to work with officials, to work with public servants, and to find out how we can help them do their work. And so that's something that is important. And again, we asked the Auditor General, what is driving this behavior? What is driving this behavior? Why are unelected public servants taking these shortcuts, not providing the proper documentation, not providing the proper quality control, not following the proper procurement rules? And the Auditor General stated that it's likely related to public servants either being either not understanding the rules fully, perhaps being overwhelmed by the complexity and the sheer number of all the rules, or again, simply that those rules need to be reinforced and repeated and ingrained in the culture of those particular public servants. And so that's what we heard in that's what we heard in the testimony today. We had some great questions that were asked around the table. I'd be curious to find out how we can deploy technology perhaps to help the public service. And here I'm thinking of, for example, AI, which is able to deal with complex systems and complex situations, help public servants to, again, make sure that they're referring to a checklist of things, items that need to be conducted for every procurement, no matter how small or how large. We asked questions about why do some public officials go back to the same well, go back to the same companies? What are some of the dangers what are some of the risks that we open the door to when we have these chains of non-competitive contracts? And that elevates, obviously, the risk element for those types of decisions. It seems like sometimes public servants simply get into a rhythm. I don't know if that's even the word for it, or a habit or a rhythm. They go back to the same companies time and again. And so how do we challenge that? And how does PSPC, as the overseer of the procurement process, how does PSPC deploy its challenge function? This is something that we heard as well today. And so we know that the departments are ultimately responsible. We know that the officials are ultimately responsible making those decisions, and we know that public servants make those decisions, but within those departments. But how does PSPC utilize its challenge function effectively to put a brake on a particular procurement that it finds troubling, and to basically say, no, go back to the drawing board, IRCC, or go back to the drawing board, CBSA, and you need to do this. You haven't fulfilled task A, B, and C. And so that's another question, is how do we actually strengthen the oversight role of PSPC, but do that without actually grinding the work of government to a standstill? And I think that's the critical element here, is we're trying to balance the need for accountability, the need for having checks and balances, but also the need for efficiency, to not slow down the process of government. Because again, the decisions that are being made here impact Canadians, whether it's procuring PPE, whether it's procuring vaccines during COVID, whether it's procuring infrastructure investments, strengthening infrastructure, whether it's making sure that the benefits delivery modernization is moving forward so that Canadians and seniors can get their OAS paychecks, they can get their GIS, and so students can get their student loans, and so on and so forth. Canadians depend on a well-functioning government. And so how do we balance that need for accountability, the checks and balances, but at the same time, making sure that we're not adding unnecessary red tape? But again, the Auditor General had an answer to that as well. We don't need new rules. What we need is for unelected officials, for public servants to follow the rules that currently exist. And that is something that is absolutely critical. And so I look at this motion that is here before us, and I'm just had a chance to really read through it now. And the member calls for folks that the Auditor General has already stated has absolutely nothing to do with this issue of these contracts. Dominic Barton, my goodness. There is everything that the Auditor General, everything that the Procurement Ombudsman, every other agency that has looked at this has said this is not about politics. This is not about partisanship. This is not about any type of friendships. This is simply about public servants, unelected public servants, not following the proper rules to its full extent. That is what this is about. And again, calling the president of the Treasury Board a minister, calling the Minister of Public Services here. I mean, again, we've heard time and again today that this is 96 out of the 97 contracts had absolute zero political involvement whatsoever. And so this is what we're talking about here. And so I'd rather us, as a committee, I'd rather us take the next steps, be logical about this, avoid, trying to create what I would say a circus around this, and do the work of this committee. And the next steps be more focused and more surgical about who we, what is the next step of the work of this committee. And I think that's what's important here, and that's what I'm interested in doing. We absolutely want to strengthen the processes here of our unelected public officials. We absolutely want to strengthen compliance with procurement rules. We want to improve quality control. We want to improve documentation. I mean, that really is the gap. When you read all of the reports of the Procurement Ombudsman and the Auditor General, that is what they're saying, is that we need to strengthen documentation. We need to improve the culture of documentation. Show your work. That is what we do. And again, this is something that needs to be improved. And this is what the Auditor General and her work and her team's work, which again, we applaud. She's really done us a tremendous service here, raising this issue, shining a light on this issue. And again, the Auditor General has pointed what is the issue and what is the road or what is the path to improving the accountability in our public service. And so with that, I will yield the floor and happily circle back again to continue discussion on this important issue.
Thanks. I have Mr. Genuis, then Mr. Susa, then Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you, Chair. Just very, very briefly, Conservatives have put forward a reasonable motion to study the issue of McKinsey contracting with this NDP-Liberal government and to call relevant witnesses. The Liberals are trying to prejudge what the conclusions of that discussion might be. I think we should hear from the witnesses. Some of these witnesses are people that are very close to this NDP-Liberal government. A former staffer who's also someone who worked for McKinsey, as well as Dominic Barton, someone who has been extensively involved with this government. I'm sure they can offer whatever defense that there is to be offered. The fact is, we know that McKinsey and this NDP-Liberal government have a very close relationship. Contracts have spiked under this government over the last 9 years. There's been massive growth in the amount of contracts that McKinsey has gotten. And Liberals would have you believe that the government had nothing to do with this. This was all somehow, as soon as Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, the nonpartisan public servants were way more enthusiastic about McKinsey than they had been previously. It was purely coincidental that this enthusiasm for McKinsey swept over the unelected public service as soon as Liberals came into office. Meanwhile, Liberals were passive bystanders to the things that were happening in the departments that they were supposed to be running. I don't buy that, Mr. Chair. I don't think you should buy it either. But in any event, let's hear from the witnesses and let's get to the bottom of what happened.
Thank you. Mr. Susa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the concerns that all of us share in terms of trying to foster solutions, improvements, and value for money in the work that's being done through procurement throughout the system. And notwithstanding some members' childish name calling of the activities involved, it's important that we take the proper steps to ensure corrections are taken. And we've noted that there's been shortcomings in the system. It's been noted by the Ombudsman and by the Auditor General on previous occasions. Recommendations have been made and have been adopted. And we continue to move forward to find and foster those improvements. The value for money audit is something that's concerning all of us. And certainly the Auditor General explained that it wasn't just she wasn't able to say that there was no value for money. She wasn't able to assess value for money. And that's concerning, right? I mean, the idea is to ensure that there's a focus on the needs when we look for the procurement, that we have an understanding of the expected deliverables, and then the provided outcomes exist so that ultimately there is an intent of proper achievements with respect to those contracts and procurement to assess value for money. And the Auditor General noted that in her comments. And you know, some of the operations and some of the contracts that have been fulfilled and some of them which are still ongoing have had a need, and there are issues as to why we require those partnerships. Now, some around the table have also suggested maybe the civil service and they should be hired as opposed to being contracted. In other words, hire more individuals into the system and increase our bureaucracy to do some of this work. But the Auditor General in her comments also noted that that wasn't feasible either. And she made it very clear that there was no interference or elected officials' engagement or previous activities as had happened in the previous government. They haven't been reflected here. And that is important because the rigor of the system must be maintained. And she also referenced that there was nothing unique in regards to the McKinsey per se, because the situation had been addressed already. There were a number of concurrent engagements that were being reviewed. And I do like her recommendation for standardized conflict of interest disclosures that would be broadly adopted across all departments to provide some uniformity in that regard. But there was no coordinated effort. There was there's reputable companies that have been involved in procuring contracts to the government of Canada, as in this recent government, in the government of today, as well as it was in the past. McKinsey has been used by other levels of government throughout Canada and throughout the world. So the purpose here is to ensure that proper procedures are taken in place. I think that's what the Auditor General is recommending. The politicalization of the situation is, I think, part of the motivation here, and doing more YouTubes and so forth on the part of the opposition. They'll streamline some of these activities as of outcomes of today. But what we need to make sure is that we provide greater integrity in the system and we provide further transparency in the system for the benefit of Canadians, not for trying to promote some partisanship or using cute phrases and so forth. These are real issues, Mr. Chair. These are real issues that matter to Canadians and matter to the members of this committee. And we want to make certain that we look at them in a holistic manner. We have reviewed the very individuals that are being asked to come before this committee have already appeared on many occasions, and we've already been discussing the process of procurement. We've already adopted some of the measures that the Ombudsman and others have suggested that we take. We have already made clear, and by those that are reviewing and investigating, that there's been no interference, there's been no criminality, there's been no persuasion of elected officials or ministers or otherwise. But there has been a shortage of skill sets. There has been a shortage of required training to do some of the work. And that is what has been reported. The size and scope of some of the activities are also of concern, right? We have a lot of contracts well beyond that McKinsey has been reviewed by. We have many others. So those initiatives and those monitoring systems must be applied throughout the system. And that's what I believe is more concerning to all of us, that those proper procedures do take place. And we are trying to be proactive. I mean, we've been proactive by requesting some of the reviews and investigations, and those that have fallen short, we've had corrective measures, and some have had disciplinary measures. In this case with McKinsey, that wasn't evident by the Auditor General. So I believe it's important for us to move forward on those recommendations, to move forward on the issues that require us to operate the system better, but to go backwards and then determine, some of the engagements and trying to hold people to account, they should always be held to account. Every minister is held to account. It's their role in regards to the government operations. Now, some ministers of the past and in previous governments may not have been doing an effective job, but we need to ensure that we will always continue to do so and learn from the previous mistakes of the governments. But we will take the steps necessary, and I think we've identified those steps. And so I'm looking forward to moving in a positive manner to ensure that we have the proper skill sets, to ensure that we have the proper procedures in place, to ensure that we monitor them effectively, and to ensure that we have positive outcomes so that we can then properly assess that value for money. And clearly, the Auditor General said there may have been, we just couldn't properly assess it. And that, I think, is what's at the crux of the matter, to ensure that we do. And I'll pass it on at this point, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Susa. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, listen, we can't be against apple pie. That is wanting to get to the bottom of things and wanting to find what isn't working to support solutions that are durable and sustainable. A number of the people mentioned in the motion were already met with last year and were asked very specific questions. And I'm wondering, I'm not against the motion fundamentally, but I'm wondering if we might be able to seek out something else other than information from the some tens of thousands of pages we have about McKinsey and in the Hansard that we also have. That being said, as I said, if there is a need felt to meet with these people, if people have significant emotional needs that they need to see them, we can do so. What I have a problem with is the the vagueness and the wording. We're talking about public servants from a number of departments and agencies. Do we intend to meet all of the public officials whose name is on a contract? Is that the intention? How many public servants are there? How many contracts are there? Are we going to meet each and every one of them whose name appears on a contract to try to identify the problem and whether they are somehow implicated in their work with McKinsey? I think it's not specific enough. What are we looking for? What is the objective? We need to avoid making the error that was made in the awarding of contracts, which is not knowing what we want exactly. I understand that we want the truth. We want to find solutions. We want to get to the bottom of things. I understand all of that, and it is essential to do so. But the means that we get there, is that the right means? Is it to be this vague, this broad, this imprecise? And it may even harm us, because when we draft things so imprecisely, we may get lost in reams of irrelevant information. And we may also sow fear among public officials about being punished for steps that they forgot, perhaps not even consciously. And that could make them feel distrustful of the committee. And so what are we ready to do as a committee? All of that needs to be answered. As I said, studying McKinsey, studying the contract awards, yes, of course, that is important. There is something very abnormal and unusual to see that 58% of contracts did not have justification. And I will reuse the word. It is just shocking. It's flabbergasting. So, nevertheless, how do we do this? And I'm asking the committee, how do we do this? Do we invite every single official from the departments? Is that what we want? Because that will be endless. And one last question. How many meetings do we plan to sit? Do we meet them all at once, one by one? When will we find the time? Will we wear out our interpreters and technicians by asking them to work all through July and August? Is that what we're looking for? I don't think so. At least that's not what I want. I don't know about you, but I don't want to cause stress and burnouts for that. I'd like to get the truth, but I don't want to destroy the people who work for us. So, yes, study McKinsey. Let's get to the bottom of things. Let's find the truth. But the motion needs to be tightened up. It needs to be improved. And that's what I suggest to my colleagues, is we need to find a consensus to make this more targeted and to answer some of the many questions that I've had in the last few weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Vignola. Mr. Jawari?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the statements that I'm about to make are my conclusions or my observation for the first hour that I was here. I left for the second hours to attend one of our colleagues' events, which we do jointly, Matt Genuis, on Father's Day on the Hill. By the way, happy Father's Day to everyone who's a father. And so why am I saying that is I'm caveating what I heard for the first hour. So as I left, and when I asked the Auditor General, I said, okay, so have you seen this over the last 12 years of your study, the span of the 12 years? So it looks like the process inconsistencies or the process not being followed was through 12 years in a very consistent way. Some of that 12 years were conservatives, some of them were liberals. So it does. I don't think it has anything to do with whether it started 2012, because the study started 2012. If we had started 2010, probably we would have seen that. Then we looked at the departments and agencies and also Crown Corporation. And we saw, despite the fact that Crown Corporation is let's say is extended arms length organizations, the same, and two different processes, two different systems, the same inconsistency existed. And then we ask, well, what is your conclusion? And the conclusion that one of the conclusions she could come was that this is a very complicated process. It's lengthy, it's cumbersome. And also, despite the fact that the delegation of authority has been assigned to the deputy minister, they assign it to lower level, and probably the lower level are not trained, especially when you look at, the timing of when these when these contracts were being awarded. Also, I recall there were instances that the department or the ministry or the Crown Corporation was waiting for this master service level agreement, which I believe it gives them the flexibility to be able to get around some of these complexities. So, so the next logical question, had I been in the committee and I had a round, would have been, okay, we saw the peak in 2021 and 2022. What was happening during that area, and why do we see an increasing trajectory of expenditure? If you look at it, and I'm sure whether some of my colleagues pointed out to it or not, this government inherited a set of services and a set of back-end technologies, etc., that that really needed attention, and it had a very progressive and aggressive agenda. And for us to be able to do that, we had to make sure what are the best practices around the world. And McKinsey is one of those organizations, not the only organization, but one of those organizations. Now, when you look at the amount of money that's been sent, and by no means I'm trying to defend any management consulting or McKinsey. I just want to be very clear on that. When you look at the over the span of that, the $200 million. And when you look at it, the amount of money that we spend on McKinsey was about 0.27% of the total money that was spent on all external management consulting. So really, I don't think and that's how I perceived of what the Auditor General was saying. And I think she alluded to that as well. But this is not really about McKinsey, and this is not really about favoritism, et cetera. It was a combination of processes not being followed, processes being too complicated. People probably, if you look at some of those performance requirements, and I'm just reaching really out there. If you look at some of the performance requirement, if your performance and your bonus is depending on getting something done, and then you're cumbered and you are let's say handcuffed with a process which is lengthy and complicated, you're going to find creative ways to be able to get your job done. And that the whole concept of master service level agreement could be one of those ways that you get creative around being services. And it could be that the use of master service level agreement, which is an umbrella, and then giving people, the decision makers, that flexibility to be able to put some of the services that they require under that. So is that what really the master service level agreement is designed for? I don't know. And that's where we should be focusing. Why am I building that? Why am I referring to all of that? Is that I don't think the focus should be on McKinsey, because McKinsey is about 0.27%. The focus should be on these processes that they're very complicated, the training of the individuals, understanding the delegation of authority, and training the people, and then putting the measures, as Auditor General has suggested, in actually monitoring that. That's where we should be focusing. So if the focus of so-called McKinsey is going to go in that direction, and by the way, we're doing a red tape reduction study, okay? Why can't this go into the red tape reduction study and say, hey, look, let's look at master service level agreement. Has there been any cases that the master service level agreement has been used as a way to be able to expedite the processing? Why don't we have expedited processing? Why do we have 600 small businesses such as GC Strategy that have somehow mastered the process, the cumbersome process, and someone who is a small startup, one individual firm trying to get into developing and helping the government, it has to go to someone like GC Strategy. Those are the ones that if you want to focus on, that's where we should be focusing on. I had an opportunity to quickly look at the list that was given, that was suggested that we have. So Dominic Barton was already gone. He's been here. He made his statement. He was gone from even the what do you call it, the infrastructure bank. By the way, infrastructure bank, $1.7 million. I mean, I understand if you want to put, well, let's say Trans Mountain Corporation with $32 million, I understand that. But bringing McKinsey or bringing business infrastructure bank for $1.7 million contract, I don't know. So then the current global McKinsey partner, he was there. And we asked him, I specifically asked him, I said, you know what, why all of a sudden an interest in Government of Canada? He goes, well, we decided as part of the strategy, we're going to increase our footprint in Canada. And if you look at their footprint compared to all others, it's not very much. Okay. And then I look at say current global partners of McKinsey. Okay, so I've talked about that. Then Boyan, former engagement manager of McKinsey, former director of policy to the Minister of Services and Procurement Canada. Okay, so this Government of Canada Procurement Services was one of the departments. But I mean, we don't need to bring him, or sorry, bring this individual in. Okay, President of Treasury Board, estimate 8. President of Public Services, estimate 8. Department of National Defense and officials. I mean, what are they going to tell us? They're going to tell us, yeah, well, you know what? We needed to get the job done. We were asked to follow the procedures, and we found that the master service like probably is the best. It's interesting that I didn't see in here was the only organization who actually followed the process. I didn't see the only department, the 9 out of the 10, the only department they're very complimentary. I didn't see their name in here. Probably if you're going to ask anybody to come here, it would be them. Ministry of Energy and Resources, because they followed almost all the procedures. And they researched, well, out of the 5, they did 4, and they were so why are we inviting them? Because they're going to say, well, we followed the procedure. There was no influence. Well, the issue is these departments didn't follow the procedure. Why? It's not that they want to break the rules. It's just that because the procedures, most probably, as the Auditor General said, is very complicated. And people try, when it's complicated, you try to get creative. And if there are opportunities within the framework that's being presented to you to be creative to get your job done, you'll do it. So public sector pension investment, we've asked them for documents. You're going to invite them. They're not going to come and talk about any of these things because they're going to say the national security. Trans Mountain Corporation, Canada Infrastructure Bank, I already talked about. As I said, why not the Ministry of Natural Resources, who could come here and says, you know what? We understand this is the procedure. We understand that there's a delegation of authority. This is how we document it, et cetera, et cetera. Then we could say, well, why wasn't this followed in the others? And this is what the Auditor General was trying to figure out as well. And this is what the responsibility of the, officials in the of the ministries and of the deputy ministers and the officials. I think I've made the point of what the focus of the study should be. It's on the process. It's on why it's not being followed, why some tools are being used as a way to be able to get around the complexity, okay, and gives them the flexibility to be able to do the job that they do. And that's where we should focus. And I also say, hey, look, we have a study. We have a study around red tape, reduction. Probably this should be part of that as well. And on that note, Mr. Chair, I move to suspend the meeting.
Excuse me.
Just a point. I don't think there's any such.
Yeah, you can't move to suspend. There's adjourn only, but not suspend.
I didn't want to adjourn because
you
it's so
can't.
wordy, but okay, I did my best.
Anyone else want to speak? Mr. Bachrach? It is an important debate, and I appreciate the vigor with which my Liberal colleagues are going at their line of defense. Noting the time, I wonder if there is a motion that would be in order that would simply allow us to pick this up at the next meeting.
We are running out of resources. We either suspend, which forces basically we punt red tape Wednesday and continue this, or we adjourn and then someone can bring a motion to bring this back the next meeting.
Isn't there a motion that we could bring forward to simply pick this up next time?
Well, that would be if we suspended.
But we're not allowed to make a motion to suspend according to.
No, I can suspend at the end.
I move a motion to ask the chair to suspend the meeting?
We get different advice on whether a motion to suspend from the committee is in order. but-
Standing.
Well, I can do either. If there's a general consensus that we'd like to continue this, we can avoid adjourning and then waiting for someone just to move a motion to restart the debate.
You would like to, I think it's preferable that we
Sure.
continue next.
Our preference would be that we have a vote on this.
Yes, I realize that.
That we have a vote.
Suggestion, let's move forward with your suspension and then have someone bring it forward at their discretion.
Well, it'd be adjourning.
Well, whatever you said just prior to that.
Can we get to a vote on this right now?
I don't think we're.
No, a vote on this
No,
motion.
No, we're not voting. No.
Continuing.
No.
Well, I am going to,
Chair, is there anyone on the speaker list?
no, there's no one else
Well,
to
then let's
speak
vote.
on this,
I
but we're
prefer to be
running,
on it.
but we're running, okay, we're basically out of resources. That's what I was getting at. So I'm going to adjourn.